So, scholars approaching the theme of the Herodotian description of the world, that is Herodotus 4:36-45, are aware that it implies dealing with a series of issues that cannot be summarized, as one might believe, only in a polemic of geographical nature, which targets and mocks those who, in the past, have outlined ges periodus. For Herodotus, the debate is the right occasion to suggest a personal interpretation of the relationship between the areas forming his contemporary world. It's an innovative proposal which gives each continent a neutral meaning, a meaning that's not bound to any ideological purpose. Herodotus introduces the discussion on size and configuration of Asia, Europe and Libya by expressing strong perplexities about the existence of the Hyperboreans, for whom it should be postulated, according to a mental mechanism of symmetrical and analogical construction, the specular presence of men who would live in the extreme southern regions of the world. The historian criticizes those who draw the world as round and encircled by the ocean river, and Asia, Europe, and Libya as having the same extent. Herodotus' alternative reconstructions begins with the delimitation of the position of the Persians, who are said to extend as far as the Persian Gulf and who are followed to the north by the Medes, the Saspiris, and the Colchians. This is chapter 37. Starting from this group of peoples, two peninsulas extend westwards. One coincides with the Anatolian Peninsula, chapter 38. The other includes Persia, Assyria, and Arabia, ending in the Red Sea, chapter 39. Eastwards, beyond the Persians, the Medes, the Saspiris, and the Colchians, the land is bounded to the north by the Caspian Sea and the river Arax, to the south by the Indian Ocean. Such and so great is Asia, while Libya, adjacent to Egypt, is on the second peninsula. Then Herodotus admits to wonder at those who have mapped out and divided the world into Libya, Asia, and Europe. The historian specifies that the length of the third one is equal to that of the other two together, and adds that it's impossible to compare their respective width, because nobody has ever been able to prove that Europe and Asia are completely surrounded by waters. Here you have a comparison between two different conceptions of oikoumene. The third point of Herodotus' criticism opens with the following remark. It's chapter 45. Udecus balestai epoteo mieus ege unomata trifasia keitai eponymias econta gyunaikon. The Herodotus states that he doesn't know those who assigned female denominations to the continents, and declares to be skeptical about the opinion of those who believe that Libya was named after a woman from that land, Asia after a wife of Prometheus, or after Asius, son of the Lydian king Cotys, and Europe after the Tyrian Europe. The primary cause of this uncertain and confusing denominative necessity is identified in the tripartite conception of the oikoumene, which would be segmented into its three components, either by the Nile and the Phasis, or, as some argue, by the Nile, the Tanais, and the Cimmerian Bosphorus. So, the main problem consists in the wrong claim to identify some dividing elements. For Herodotus, the earth is one and indivisible. Bold in the text, you have mie euse ge. Herodotus' reasoning transforms a geomorphological issue into a geopolitical one. Starting from the explanation about the physical characteristics of the oikoumene, the author moves his attack on the arbitrariness of the spatial partition proposed by his predecessors. The refutation of these theories corresponds to a double refusal. On one side, to use names as an act of political and intellectual organization of the territory, on the other, to recognize Europe, Asia, and Libya as units with fixed boundaries. I believe that this new look at the overall space of the world, which implies a peculiar reconsideration of the relations between Asia and Europe, emerges clearly from the way Herodotus uses the term epeiros. This term is frequent in the histories. In 14 cases, it indicates the land, sometimes in relation to the sea. In 32 cases, it's the mainland as opposed to the islands. In 20 cases, it has a meaning which is comparable, with due caution, to that of the modern notion of continent, and upon which it's worth dwelling, I think. So, in the third book, after having been cured by the Greek doctor Democedes, Atossa encourages his husband Darius, king of Persia, to channel his youthful vitality into the realization of great deeds and the submission of new ethne. Darius acknowledges the rightness of the queen's incitement and reveals that he has already made a decision on a possible goal. His plan is to march against the Scythians after throwing a bridge, it's the first passage, Ectesde tesepeiru esten eteren epeiron, from this continent to the other continent. The news about the fulfillment of this second purpose is the crucial point of the call for alliance and the mutual aid launched by the Scythian ambassadors to the kings of the neighboring peoples. We are in the fourth book. The ambassadors announced that the enemy, having subjugated all the peoples who inhabited Ente, Epeiro, Etere in the other continent, has now arrived, thanks to a bridge of boats, Estende ten Epeiron, in this continent, is the second passage. The ambassadors say also that Darius, since he crossed this continent, the third passage, has already enslaved many Thracian tribes. As we can see, Darius' expansion project and the persuasive power of the Scythian words are dialectically supported by the antithesis between this, Hode continent, and the other, Heteros continent, alternatively identifiable with Europe and Asia. The use of the adjective heteros implies the affirmation of a binary polarity, which seems to exclude Libya from the list of existing lands. In this regard, it's significant that during the dialogue between the Spartan king Cleomenes and the tyrant of Miletus, Aristagoras, the latter referred to the Asian Epeiros using ekeinos. It's the fourth passage. The bronze table that Aristagoras brings with him is engraved with the periodos of all the earth, which probably also includes the third Epeiros, and, above all, makes the pretext of continental duality practically and rhetorically useless. It's been observed that this idea of a bi- or tripartite oikoumene is not confirmed by the royal Achaemenid inscriptions, from which we can deduce a tendency to make the fringes of the physical world coincide with the fringes of the empire. This leads us to suppose that Herodotus, as a narrator, worked at the level of the discursive dimension. So, the main characters of each episode pronounce expressions which are adequate to present a movement of aggression planned by Darius against the areas extending beyond the Bosphorus as a movement of Asia aggressing Europe. A historically more reliable reflection of the Persian perception of the world is perhaps contained in the episode of the stele raised by Darius in order to celebrate the sweetness of the waters of the river Theos. The epigraph closes with a reference to the genealogical ancestry and the royal title, Darius, son of Hystaspes, king of Persia and all the continent. There is no lack of knowledge on the part of Darius of the fact of being in Europe. More simply, I think, Herodotus indicates here not one of the three portions of the world, but a physical reality that expands as much as the king moves forward in his conquest. A possible objection is that the function of Ode in the cited passages is to highlight the space-time situation and, consequently, that the meaning of the opposition with the counterpart heteros is to be explained on the basis of the deictic center of the statesmen. So, for Darius, who at the time of the dialogue with Atossa is in Susa, the expression "this continent" indicates Asia. For the Scythians, who live north of the Black Sea, this continent indicates Europe. The spatial deixis relates language to the position of people and objects in space. Herodotus rarely uses the same deictic in his topographical descriptions. The only exception is the expression hede θάλασσα, this sea, which designates the expanse of water explored by the Phoenicians after the abandonment of the Erythraean Sea, the sea cut through by those traveling to Babylon from the west and largely touched by Libya, in other words, the Mediterranean Sea. It's been recently underlined that this stylistic singularity depends on the author's willingness to emphasize the Greek perspective of his own narrative. Consistent with such a reading, the linguistic need to which the Herodotian expression tries to respond is similar to the communicative need that motivates the presence of hede eperos in the examples presented. In respect to this interpretative proposal, two further considerations seem necessary. Herodotus' opinion on the totality of the sea waters occupying large sections of the world's surface is contained in the chapters dedicated to the description of the Caspian Sea. This sea has, as its primary characteristic, the fact that it's a sea by its own, without links to the other sea, bold in the text, te ethere thalassae. Since in the histories are mentioned multiple expanses of water, the name of which is influenced by many different factors, the use of heteros in this context may seem at least unusual. And yet, the expression ethere thalassae implies an authentic binary relationship. According to Herodotus, the other sea, even if it's formed by the sea crossed by the Greeks, by the sea called Atlantic and the Erythraean Sea, is in truth a single sea. Bold in the text, at the end of the passage you have mia eusa tiuncanei. So, contrary to what we have seen for the continents, the unitary character of the seas doesn't produce any denominative difficulty. The perception of oikoumene as mia ge is the main objection of Herodotus to the choice of his predecessors to assign a different name to each of the three epeiroi. This same unity is viewed as not problematic with respect to the possibility of calling with a different name the various sections, more or less large, of a single sea. It can be concluded that Herodotus doesn't consider the space of the sea and the space of the continents as being qualitatively comparable, and that he attributes distinct semantic values to Hede Thalassa and to Hede Epeiros. The historian accepts the advantages of a denominative operation that allows a spatial structuring of the Mediterranean areas. This organization is expressed, if necessary, throughout the use of Hede, with which Herodotus induces the audience of the histories only to pay attention to a near and common space, without arousing any feelings of ethnic belonging. The occurrences of Hede Epeiros, on the contrary, are inserted in dialogues in which the dialectical contrast between these and the other continent aims at underlining a political or military ideology not shared by our author. This is evident not only from the criticism of the triple denomination, but also, and I come to the second consideration, from the careful selection of the lexicon. We never find Hede Epeiros as used by Herodotus in his own voice. The invitation to the audience to focus their gaze on the European continent is expressed through a different adjective, houtos, or better, hauta. Even when Epeiros is absent, the ge to which Herodotus denies that Europe of Tyre has ever come and given its name, Europe of course, is designated by haute. The notion of a Europe Epeiros as a sort of political entity opposed to an Asia Epeiros equally connoted is reflected in the histories but doesn't enjoy authorial endorsement. For Themistocles, who, after the Battle of Salamis, discusses with Eurybiades whether or not to pursue the Persian fleet towards the Hellespont, the separation between Asia and Europe is a fact on which it's good, after the failure of the conquest of Xerxes, not to intervene again. The acceptance of his words by the Athenians proves that there was a collective consensus on the division of the world and the ontological antagonism of two of its components, a consensus which Herodotus prefers not to endorse. For Herodotus, the real problem seems to consist not in the division of the oikoumene itself, but in the political and cultural polarization between West and East, a polarization which transforms names into ideological concepts and becomes an instrument of interpretation of man and society. At this point, we have to ask ourselves why Herodotus, despite such a strong criticism, makes extensive use of the traditional names of the continents. The answer to the question is provided by the historian himself, who, closing the digression on the shape of the earth and returning to the narrative of Darius' march against the Scythians, states what follows. Tautamenniu epitosuto eiresto, toisigar nomizomenoisi auton chresometa. The semantic core of this short period, the first half of which contains a typical Herodotian closing formula of descriptions, discussions, and digressions, lies in the participle construction. Tois nomizomenoisi, in bold, refers to the heritage of geopolitical opinions that are firmly rooted in the minds of the Greeks of the 5th century, and which Herodotus can't allow himself to disregard. The correct reception of the histories depends on the historian's ability to use widespread and shared knowledge and to stimulate interest in the audience, starting from what the recipients, rightly or wrongly, consider sure acquired, and in the light of the new perspective suggested in the work. Therefore, the names Europe and Asia are accepted as territorial labels that satisfy the need of order of thought. Herodotus, however, invites to question in depth the current and hidden meaning of conventional denominations. It's a constant work of critical and conscious re-evaluation, which represents one of the essential foundations of history. Now, let us consider Herodotus' description of the fringes of the oikoumene, which seems to be equally and partially built on the audience's expectations. On the correct reception of this description, an important role seems to be played by the civic dimension of the Greeks, experienced by the historian both as a citizen of a Carian polis of Asia Minor and as a settler of a new foundation in Great Greece. To understand this link, it's useful to briefly recall what Hecataeus of Miletus says in order to persuade his fellow Ionian citizens not to fight against Darius. According to Herodotus, Hecataeus listed all the ethne were subject to the Persian king. In Greek you have katalegon tate ethnia pantatonerke dareios. Why was his warning totally discarded? The text of the histories doesn't allow us to deduce much more than we read, namely that the warning went unheeded. But it seems to me that disregard of Hecataeus' wise advice depends on a real inability to grasp the actual dimensions of the danger. If Greek political space is conceived as formed by a polis, its politai and its hora, it's evident that the Hecataeus people list provides a representation of Persian political power that doesn't make any sense in respect to the daily experience and practice of the citizens of Miletus. The political community formed by a polis and a surrounding area is so different from a great empire that controls large and distant regions. A simple sequence of names has no meaning. In the already cited dialogue between Cleomenes and Aristagoras, the path from Sardis to Susa is presented by the tyrant by insisting on the peoples that one meets along the way. The Spartan king can't understand the spatial implications of such a description. Only after the intervention of a temporal parameter, 3 months are necessary to fill the distance, Cleomenes fully understands the exceptional nature of the deed proposed by Aristagoras, who is ordered to leave Sparta immediately, without delay. The episode of Hecataeus' misunderstood advice is a good example of how the structure of the polis could influence the approach to a different civilization. Hecataeus and Herodotus, who were politai but also tireless travelers, could certainly develop spatial perceptions that were more elastic, free from the narrowness of views that spending all life in one place inevitably entails. And yet, the ordering principles of the edges of the oikoumene that Herodotus describes appear to be partially depending on the characteristics of the civic escatiai, located far from the urban center but not beyond the scope of the polis. Of course, it's understandable that the historian transposes his own civic experience to other local contexts, in which the scale remains more or less on the same values. The application of the same interpretative method to the great escatiai of the oikoumene is, on the contrary, less straightforward. The daily fragmentation of civic spaces led politai, and therefore also the audience of the histories, to develop a baggage of knowledge and experience in which the allusions of Herodotus to marginal areas of similar type could produce associations of meaning without excessive difficulty. We may presume. This comparative process changes substantially when Herodotus has to relate about the eschatii of the oikoumene. In this case, the reasoning doesn't proceed by symmetrical comparison, because there is nothing comparable. What prevails is rather the connotative component of the civic eschatii, their symbolic value. As we know, each polis elaborated representations that were expression of cultural values and social traditions strongly localized and not extendable to other contexts. We may think of Athenian ephebia. I believe that the historian, having remarked how the eschatii were incorporated into the socio-economic functioning of a given political community and at the same time charged with a considerable ideological value, decided to articulate on these two aspects his exposition on the extreme regions par excellence, those of oikoumene. So, India, which lies at the world's most distant eastern limit, Arabia, which lies at the world's most distant southeastern limit, and Ethiopia, which lies at the world's most distant southwestern limit, are remembered not only as lands that provide King Darius with gifts. Compared to Greece, which received the best seasons, India, Arabia, and Ethiopia are worth of mention because they enjoy the things the Greeks consider as most beautiful. The list includes animals, plants, flowerings, and metals. The statement you have in italic in the slide, the most outlying nations of the world have somehow drawn the finest things as their lot, opens and closes the review of the peoples settled at the borders of the inhabited world. And it's remarkable that, despite the greater uncertainty about the exact configuration of the most remote western regions of Europe, even these ones are qualified by the possession of valuable goods such as amber, tin, and gold, present in large quantities in the north of the continent. Thus, Herodotus gathers under a single connotative definition the eschatii that surround and close within them every other country. The insistence on the presence of those elements that peoples who occupy the middle area miss, far from revealing the use of a parameter of otherness, this insistence is the conceptual tool filling the great distance between the center and the fringes of the world. This distance is not expressed in spatial and measurable terms, but it's translated into a qualitative distinction. It's an intellectual procedure that Herodotus derives from the tendency, observable in many Greek polis, to think of the relationship between center and periphery as a relationship between two places that are not only concretely but also symbolically distant. The eschatii of the world, these geographical realities which are difficult to experience at first hand, are made close by Herodotus to the daily life of each polites. In this way, the historian can be sure that his historie is fully understood by his Greek recipients. Thanks for your attention.